It seems very easy to put sanctions on countries, but it seems very difficult to remove them. We see it everywhere. We saw it with Iran as well. With
Yeah.
JCPOA, we had this agreement. They did everything they were supposed to do. We didn't remove the sanctions.
Right.
Trump comes into office. I was thinking, well, one of the easiest things he could do to help restore relations is ease up on some of these sanctions. Obviously it seems like a good thing to do because it hasn't hurt Russia. It's actually hurt Europe and the United States more than it's actually hurt Russia. So what's the point of putting on these sanctions? Instead, we saw more sanctions get put on. So I think what I'm wondering is there just some, there's that famous Milton Friedman quote, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. Is this kind of the situation that we're seeing with sanctions? Is once you put it in place, it's like, well, there's too much paperwork to remove it. So we gotta, what is it that makes it so difficult to remove sanctions, but so easy to put on sanctions?
Yeah. Well, I think actually in that case, Milton Friedman is right. And I think it's part of that kind of that general phenomenon that we observe in government. A new agency is created. It's never abolished. Trump is trying to do that right now. I don't know if he's going to have success, like with the Department of Education. But in general, it's just never does anybody say, like 3 years down the road, hey, this didn't really work out. This is not producing the benefits we thought it would. Let's close this program down. Those programs always have a way of expanding. What you do is, in essence, you create an interest group. And for them, the maintenance and expansion of their particular program or agency is existential. That's their jobs or whatever, and they will fight tooth and nail to hang on to and convince everybody that they're extremely important. So these agencies, they just stay forever. And it's the same thing with sanctions. I think part of it is that there ends up being kind of there will be a group of people, some ideologically motivated, others motivated by financial gain that, say have a real interest in maintaining the sanctions, and they will fight tooth and nail to prevent their elimination or their repeal. To give you an example, there were sanctions that were actually imposed on the Soviet Union. And I think it was all the way back in the 1970s, and with respect to like Jewish immigration from Soviet Union. I'm trying to remember the something Levitsky Act. But the Soviet Union fell, right? and the Russian Federation was established. It wasn't until 20 years after the establishment of the Russian Federation that act was finally repealed. It was just there. There was no reason in the world for maintaining it. And then about a year afterwards, a new one that did almost exactly the same thing was imposed. So we have Putin actually telling the same union of industrialists and entrepreneurs, he said, don't expect the sanctions to go away. Even if, overall relations improve, he said, I'm being honest with you. These sanctions are here to stay for the foreseeable future. And so I think that's something that Russia accepts. And it's something, again, they show that they've weathered the sanctions. They've even, parts of the Russian economy really have thrived. And so they don't care. That's one thing the Americans said is like, the Russians aren't demanding that we remove the sanctions. I think they would be happy if they were removed, mainly as just a goodwill gesture. And, some of the sanctions, I think we have to be honest, some of them do cause economic harm to Russia, but the Russian economy has proven itself to be very resilient. Again, it's not a gas station masquerading as a country. It's actually a very complex and advanced and diversified economy. And so it was able to absorb the sanctions and move on. And so it's not really a pressing, burning issue for them. So again, it would be good. It would make sense really more from our point of view, again, especially Europe's. But, we are talking about maybe ending the sanctions. Sometimes we get murmurings of that from within the administration. But the Europeans seem to be adamant. They seem to be adamant about their own demise. It's a kind of a suicide pact in Europe.
Yeah, you feel like the only solution now would just to be get rid of all the sanctions. We just got to cut through them. Like they're not working. They never work. They always cause problems. I mean, what do you say? There was 25,000 sanctions on Russia?
Well, I heard it was okay. A couple months ago, I heard it was 24,311. And then more recently, I heard a figure of northwards of 29,000. So I don't know what's right. But
A lot.
anyway, an awful lot.
A lot. And I mean, so you think about that's just Russia. I mean, we sanction what a third of the countries in the world are sanctioned by the United States.
Yeah,
It's
at
like it's
least.
so many that we can't even keep up with it. And if Russia has almost 25 to 30,000 sanctions on it, think about Iran. It's probably about 1 million sanctions we have on there. Nobody keeps up on it. But it's like you said, it's this problem that the government has become this such a large machine with all these interest groups that are created that are these parasites that are just suckling on the teat of it that will keep it entrenched in place. It's gotten so big that I think the only way to do it is just say we just have to axe all of it. You can't go through each one and try to address every single interest group that's in place. And
Yeah.
I wonder if that's possible. It just feels like that's the whole problem with the U.S. government in general. It's just gotten so big, so much lobbying that it's no longer able to function, and nobody wants to touch any program because it sets off alarm bells and people don't want to deal with it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it really is impossible because the sanctions, I think the vast majority of them were done with the consent of Congress, and Congress would require a say in the lifting of the sanctions, and we just don't have, the. I think it's clear to me that you're just not going to get the votes. Maybe with the exception of a few sanctions, but the other 29,000 or however many that the hundreds of thousands that exist across the world, I think they're here to stay for a long time. It's very unfortunate, but I think that's the case.
Right. Yeah, I mean, think about there's all these congressmen, all these politicians, all the lobbying power that is gone, all the money that's going in to keep certain things in place, keep certain policies in place, vote a certain way. This seems to be the fundamental problem with our system now, right? It's just we have to remove this lobbying influence. Like, I don't know how to feel about this. Like democracy, the idea is great, but if you have it with this lobbying, and we like say capitalism, it's a great thing. People can strive and make as much money as they want to achieve, but if you're able to use that money to just push policy that you want to benefit yourself at the expense of everybody else, that's clearly a problem.
Yeah.
And is that fixable?
Well, in theory, it is. It seemed like to me that decades ago, I heard a lot more talk about, reducing the influence of the lobbyists. It almost seems like there were real efforts, but now I don't even hear about it so much. It seems like, we have just given up. It's just sort of like, that's the way things are. Let's be realistic. And it's a real problem. You're right. It's well, in theory, we're a democratic society, which is, I know that really it's more correct to say that we're a republic, but democratic in the sense that our government is supposed to reflect the will of the people. And that's, the same is true of Europe, but it's clear that there is an elite in charge in all these countries that do not reflect the will of the people. And it seem to be impervious to the results of elections. Now there is, an interesting battle going on in the U.S. Between Trump and his, his people, his appointees, and the deep state. So when I'm talking about the elite, like kind of the permanent political class, we can also call them the deep state. Now it's just not clear to me. And he's had some real victories. Again, we've talked about those earlier. But he himself is kind of, I don't think you want to put too much hope in this man. I mean, we have to give him credit where credit is due. But he is up against a very powerful opponent. And even when he has these victories, I think, we forget about the fact that deep state, it's taken some blows, but it's still there. And it's going to be, the problem isn't going to go away. It's not, it may be that we'll see what happens, if he can win effect some permanent changes, then you say, well, okay, maybe there's a hope that this permanent, elite, this deep state, really has been contained, or its power has been significantly reduced, and then we'll have governments in the future that are more reflective of the popular will, and therefore in that sense more democratic. But the battle is far from over, and it may be that like the deep state it survives this, and then and actually will consolidate its powers, just make sure that this never happens again. That we'll see something like what we've seen in Romania, for example, or what we're seeing in Moldova right now.
Oof. Yeah, if we're a democracy or a republic, the government's supposed to reflect the will of the people, but that's clearly not the case anymore. If it's really more accurate to say that we have a government that reflects the will of the lobby. So what would you describe that government being? What kind of government is that? Do we have a term for that?
Yeah, that's interesting. Do we actually have a term for that? I mean, I guess the term that we've been using is the deep state. It's just that,
Deep state, I mean, corporate capture. But it's not only corporations, though. I mean, if you have things like APAC.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think you make a mistake sometimes to try to, I think some people on the left make the mistake of trying to explain everything in terms of financial gain. And they're right to point to that. That's part of it. Part of it is corporate capture, especially in the area of regulation. There's no question about it. But there are also ideologues, and those ideologues, will pursue policies that actually may not benefit corporations, but they pursue them nonetheless. So, like in places like the State Department and also the security state, you find, the ideologues are in charge. In Pentagon, we see both of it. Maybe we see more of it is about financial gain, right? Again, we've talked about all these very expensive weapon systems. Why do we have them? Well, because people make a lot of money out of it. That's part of what's going on. No question about it.
Do we have solutions? Or, I mean, I think, would you say that this is really the biggest problem pressing the West in general? Everybody knows that the West is in trouble, but sometimes it's hard to explain why exactly we get lost in the weeds and start focusing on one little thing. But if we take a step back, it's really just the main problem that we have is this capture by lobbies. Would that be the main thing, or is it ideological capture as well? There's the military-industrial complex.
Right. I mean, right. Yeah. When we talk about lobbies, some of them are ideological, and I think APAC is an example of that. And then others are, clearly driven by financial greed. We have both. And I think you're right. That's kind of the larger problem. It's just sort of you could call it sort of late stage capitalism or democratic capitalism. I'm just thinking about Francis Fukuyama's, End of History, a paper that he published back in the 1990s. That time it just seemed like this was the model that everybody wanted to emulate. It was free markets and democracy. That's essentially what it was, and that was the model that clearly worked, and the whole world would aspire to. And once the whole world achieved it, that would be the end of history. Obviously that things haven't turned out the way that he predicted. And one of the problems, it's not just that there is resistance in other parts of the world, but the model itself has been, is looking less and less attractive to the rest of the world. And it is, I think, this very corrupt relationship that has been established between corporations and the government. And then the capture of a lot of policies by certain ideological groups and that are just impervious to, increasingly are just divorced from reality and impervious to popular sentiment. That is a real threat to this whole model. The model itself is in bad shape and desperately needs to be reformed. It's a tough battle. I don't know if it can be, if the whole thing, just the whole system has to be sort of, it's worth I think we should try, but we may just not succeed. Maybe the whole system has to be, taken apart, and then we have to start all over again. But that's very easily said. But that's going to be a long, very painful, and potentially bloody process.